Right, in last week's video, I explained why it's impossible that one sourdough recipe can work for absolutely everybody. One of those reasons is that everyone's flour will have different absorption capabilities, protein contents, and in some cases, possibly it will contain additives. Now, I think things get even trickier when we try to include whole wheat flour in our recipes. It's generally more thirsty, and in some cases it can produce a heavy loaf, and it can be a bit trickier to build strength in the dough. Now, this video isn't going to be me walking you through my baking process and showing you a recipe that works for me. Instead, I'm going to give you a recipe design process that you can execute to come up with a perfect whole wheat sourdough recipe that actually works for you. Now, I'm going to warn you in advance, this isn't for those looking for a quick fix, and it isn't for a complete beginner, that's for sure. This is a proper recipe design process which takes time, effort and practice. So before we start designing a recipe, there's normally some kind of discovery stage, and that's going to involve coming up with a concept, considering the ingredients we're going to use, flavour pairings, the method we'll use, our desired crumb and crust, how the final loaf will look, and so on. So to make this recipe easy, I'm going to give you a super simple brief. We'll be using a wheat sourdough culture or levain that's 100% hydrated. The flour in the recipe will be a combination of strong white bread flour and whole wheat flour. The ratio yet to be decided, as it's going to be adjusted during the test bakes. The dough is going to be proved inside a sourdough basket to produce either a ball or a batard, depending on which basket you have available. So I'm going to be using my own sourdough calculator for this recipe design. You're welcome to use it, it's free, but you can use any one you like. As long as you can see a summary page with all of the ingredients laid out in front of you, you're going to be good to go. And by the way, I've actually got a new version of my calculator coming soon. It's got lots more functionality. I'm going to let everyone know in the community email when it's released. Now, the first decision we need to make is how much dough do we need? We can't craft a recipe without first knowing how much we need to make. Now, your sourdough basket is going to determine how much dough you need. I'm using an oval basket that takes 800 grams of dough perfectly. If you were using a standard round basket, I'd suggest a dough weight of 1000 grams. Now, let's drop down to the total ingredients section. This is where all of the ingredients live, and it's where we're going to do most of the engineering. The strong bread flour has already been calculated for us. So now we need to decide how much whole wheat flour we're going to use. All of the inputs we make from now on are going to be in baker's percentages. So I'm going to start by adding 30% whole wheat flour. And as you can see, that strong bread flour adjusts automatically to 70%, keeping the total at 100%. The whole wheat flour is quite thirsty, so initially I'm going to dial that hydration in at 75%. Now I'm going to set the salt to 2%. And then lastly, of course, we need to decide how much levain I'm going to use in the recipe. So let's kick this off with 20%. Now we know we need to use 157 grams of ripe levain. And if you look over on the right-hand side, you're going to see all of the ingredients listed that we need to use. Right, so coming up with a draft formula is only the beginning and is probably the easiest bit. Now we need proof of concept. In other words, we need to get our digits dirty and actually bake this recipe. If you were under the illusion that all of the work is done within the calculator, you may be just a little bit disappointed. So we need to decide on an outline method for baking this, and it could look something like this. On Friday night, I'm going to create the levain. On Saturday morning, I'm going to mix the dough, I'll perform 2 laminations during the bulk ferment, and then I'll shape and prove the dough. That's going to be followed by an overnight cold retard in the fridge. And then on Sunday morning, I'll bake. Now that planning's done, you can actually execute the recipe, but make sure you take notes throughout that process so you know what you did, how the dough behaved, and how long things took. Under the calculator, you can see the sheet that I actually use to take notes when I'm coming up with a new recipe. Now, if I'm creating that recipe for other people to use, it's super important that I'm thorough and accurate. You may decide that you don't need to record quite as much information, so decide what's important for you to record. Now, once that loaf is baked, it's time for the visual survey and of course the taste test. You're going to need to work out what to tweak to change anything that needs improvement. And like anything that's worth doing, this step, it takes practice. There's no hack, there's no shortcut. You're only going to get better with repetition. First, you need to make sure that that method was executed perfectly, that any fault in the loaf now lie in the formula. If you're happy the dough was fermented, shaped, proved and baked correctly, now you can turn your attention back to the formula. Now first, I'd want to know if the amount of dough fitted the basket correctly. If not, I'd tweak the dough weight. Next, I'd want to know if that hydration was dialed in correctly for the blend of flour that I was using. If the loaf turned out heavy or dense, I'd probably look at increasing the hydration slightly. On the flip side, the dough might have been sloppy and the crumb a bit gummy. And in this case, I'd reduce the hydration. Next, if needed, I'd tweak the salt. And of course, lastly, I'd look back at my notes and I'd consider the time it took my dough to ferment. If I wanted to speed that process up, I might decrease the amount of levain I use, or to slow the process down, I decrease the amount. Now, I'd repeat this process over and over until I had perfected the loaf using 30% whole wheat flour. Then, and only then, would I increase the amount of whole wheat flour by 10%. And then I'd go through that test baking phase again. In the case of designing a loaf that uses whole wheat flour, I prefer to start with a lower percentage, 30% in this case, and then work upwards. This way, I can compare the results in small increments. Perhaps you'll get to 50% whole wheat flour and you'll decide that your optimum loaf only uses 40%. It's your loaf and you get to make the decisions. Now, many people find this process way too time consuming, and I get it. But you know, once you've been through this process a few times, you start to instinctively know what to do when things go wrong. I believe going through this process is one of the best ways to improve our sourdough baking. Sometimes you get lucky and you nail a new recipe in a couple of test bakes. Other times it takes a lot longer. I've actually been working on a malted fruit sourdough loaf for over 8 weeks now, and sometimes it feels like I'm actually going backwards, not forwards. But proper recipe development takes time and effort. There are no shortcuts. Now I challenge you, give this process a go, use this simple brief and create your own whole wheat recipe. Now, if you're interested in seeing me go through this entire process, from discovery stage to recipe design, from test bake to finalising a recipe, let me know and I'll see if I can film a mini series. In fact, you can give me your ideas on what sourdough loaf to create. Let your imagination run wild, but don't stitch me up. A huge thank you for watching. I'll see you again very soon. Stay tuned.